Tonight, we move softly toward the end of a long and anxious age. An age shaped not by a single battle, but by waiting, watching, listening for alarms that never came. This is the story of how the Cold War did not end with an explosion, but with conversations, with pauses, with quiet agreements made behind closed doors. So settle into stillness, let your breath slow, and allow this final chapter of a tense century to unfold gently, like a long night finally turning toward morning. For nearly half a century, the world lived beneath a shadow cast by two powerful nations, standing on opposite sides of ideology, fear, and suspicion. The United States and the Soviet Union faced each other across oceans and continents, each armed with weapons capable of ending civilization. Missiles waited in silos. Submarines moved silently beneath the seas. Radar screens glowed in dark rooms. And ordinary people lived their lives knowing that everything could change in minutes. The Cold War was not loud. It was constant. Children practiced duck and cover drills. Families built fallout shelters. Politicians spoke carefully. Mistakes could not be undone. But as the decades passed, something subtle began to shift. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, exhaustion had settled in. The cost of endless tension weighed heavily on both sides. Economies strained. Societies aged. Faith in rigid ideology weakened. In the Soviet Union, the system struggled to keep pace with a changing world. Factories were inefficient. Technology lagged. Citizens felt disconnected from promises made long ago. In the United States, public confidence wavered too. Vietnam had shaken trust. Economic uncertainty lingered. The fear of nuclear war never fully faded. Behind the scenes, leaders began to ask quieter questions. What if this could end without a winner or loser, without collapse or chaos? The first steps toward peace did not happen on grand stages. They happened in letters, in side rooms, in informal conversations between advisors. Diplomacy became softer, less theatrical, more human. One of the most important changes came with new leadership in the Soviet Union. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power. He was younger than his predecessors, more open, more willing to admit problems. Gorbachev believed that endless confrontation served no one. He introduced new ideas: openness, restructuring, reform. Words that felt dangerous in a rigid system. But words alone could not change decades of fear. Across the ocean, the United States watched carefully. Trust was fragile. Skepticism ran deep. Publicly, speeches still sounded firm. Privately, doors began to open. Back-channel diplomacy became essential. These were not official negotiations announced to the press. They were quiet exchanges between trusted individuals. Former diplomats, scholars, interpreters, advisors. People who could speak freely without microphones. They met in neutral cities, in hotel rooms, in private homes. Sometimes they walked together, just talking. They spoke about fears, about misunderstandings, about how close the world had come to disaster during past crises. They shared something rare in Cold War politics: honesty. One of the most powerful tools in ending the Cold War was empathy. The ability to see the other side not as an enemy, but as people managing their own fears. Letters passed between leaders, not always formal, sometimes personal. They spoke of children, of responsibility, of the weight of command. Gradually, the language softened. Summits followed. Meetings in Geneva, in Reykjavik, in Washington, in Moscow. The cameras captured handshakes and smiles, but the real work happened afterward. Late at night, when only a few people remained in the room, they argued quietly. They paused. They compromised. At times, talks nearly collapsed. Old mistrust resurfaced. Military advisors warned against weakness. Hardliners resisted change. But something had changed. For the first time, leaders spoke openly about reducing nuclear weapons. Not just limiting them, but removing them. The idea felt almost impossible. Entire careers had been built around deterrence, around the balance of terror, around the belief that safety came from mutual fear. Letting go required courage of a different kind. In private conversations, leaders admitted exhaustion. They spoke of sleepless nights, of imagining mistakes spiraling into catastrophe. They asked quietly, what if trust could replace fear? Arms reduction treaties followed. Weapons were counted, inspected, dismantled. Missiles that once symbolized power were taken apart slowly, piece by piece. Each reduction felt symbolic, like a breath being released after holding it too long. The Cold War also ended through restraint. When Eastern European nations began to shift, when walls cracked and protests grew, the Soviet Union chose not to respond with force. This decision mattered more than any treaty. For decades, tanks had enforced order. Now, they stayed still. It was a silent choice, but it changed history. Behind the scenes, advisors urged calm. Diplomats urged patience. Leaders resisted pressure to act. The world watched, holding its breath. And then, the unthinkable happened. The Berlin Wall fell. Not with a command, not with a treaty, but with confusion, hesitation, and a crowd that simply walked forward. No tanks moved, no orders came. Silence spoke louder than force. Soon after, the Soviet Union dissolved peacefully. Flags were lowered. New nations emerged. The Cold War was over. Not declared, not celebrated with victory parades. It simply ended. Looking back now, historians understand that the Cold War did not end because one side defeated the other. It ended because leaders chose restraint over pride, listening over shouting, patience over panic. The secret deal that ended the Cold War was not a single agreement. It was a mindset, a shared understanding that survival mattered more than dominance. Quiet diplomacy proved stronger than weapons, and this ending holds an important lesson. Peace rarely arrives loudly. It comes through conversations few people hear, through compromises that never make headlines, through decisions to pause instead of react. Tonight, as this long era settles gently into the past, we can rest knowing that even the most dangerous conflicts can end without destruction, if patience is allowed to lead.
The alarms are silent now. The screens are dark. The night is calm. And as history fades into memory, you drift gently onward, into quiet, into rest, into sleep.